The city didn't fall the way the old movies said it would. There were no explosions, no columns of smoke rising in slow majesty against the dawn, no screaming. That was the part nobody had thought to be afraid of, the silence. 7 billion people, and not one of them saying a word worth saying anymore. Mara Chen found out on a Tuesday. She remembered that specifically because she had been annoyed about a meeting. A budget review, 9 o'clock, third floor, the kind of thing that felt like a small indignity at the time. She had been standing at the coffee machine in the hallway of the Regional Emergency Coordination Office when she noticed that her colleague Brandt, who wore ironed shirts and argued passionately about fiscal policy and once stayed late 3 nights in a row to write a 40-page analysis that nobody asked for, was sitting on the floor of the open plan office with his back against a filing cabinet, stacking paper clips into a tower. He wasn't doing it frantically. He wasn't dissociating or having some kind of episode. He was doing it with the calm, concentrated pleasure of a child who had found something interesting and had no intention of stopping. She said his name. He looked up. His eyes were fine, both pupils the right size. No redness, no jaundice, but there was something gone from them that she could not immediately name. It took her 3 more seconds before she understood what she wasn't seeing. He wasn't calculating anything. He wasn't measuring her, wasn't preparing a response, wasn't running any of the 1,000 small social algorithms that a human face runs every time it looks at another human face. He was just present, blank and warm, and completely empty of anything she could reach. She set down her coffee. She said his name again. He went back to the paper clips. She found Dex in the stairwell 17 minutes later, which told her 2 things. He had gotten her emergency text, and he had not used the elevator, which meant he was already thinking clearly about exits. Dex Okafor was the kind of man who was always in some low and constant way thinking about exits. He had worked in post-conflict assessment for 11 years before the coordination office hired him, and he carried that career like a second skeleton. Invisible, but it shaped everything. How many, he said. Everyone I've seen. Whole floor, facilities too. I checked on my way out. Building? I don't know. I came straight here. He nodded. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she could see the corner of a paper notebook sticking out of it, which meant he had thought to bring something to write on in a world that might not have reliable power. She felt a specific and overwhelming gratitude for this. Roof, he said. We need to see the street. The city looked normal from above. That was the second horror. No fires, no crushed vehicles, no evidence of panic. The streets were moving. People walking, some riding bikes, a few cars drifting at low speed and then coasting to a stop when the drivers apparently lost interest. From 4 stories up, if you didn't look too closely, it could have been any slow morning. But look closely and the pattern broke down. People stopped in the middle of crosswalks and sat down. A woman was turning in a slow circle in a parking lot, watching her own shadow. A man had taken his shoes off and was examining them with the focused bewilderment of someone encountering shoes for the first time. The V3, Dex said. He didn't say it like a question. Mara had the same thought and hadn't wanted to say it first. The V3 had been a known quantity for 6 years, known in the way that a geological fault was known. Everyone acknowledged it. Very few people could explain the mechanism, and the working assumption was that acknowledgement itself was a form of management. The V3 were somewhere in the outer belt. They communicated through a narrowband signal that human linguists had spent 5 years partially decoding. The consensus among the xenolinguistics community was that they were curious rather than hostile. The consensus among the xenolinguistics community had, it appeared, been somewhat optimistic. The regression field, she said. They actually used it. She had read the theoretical brief 3 years ago. She remembered being unimpressed by it, or rather, she remembered finding it too large to feel properly afraid of. A broadcast-range neurological suppressant targeting the specific cortical architecture of human higher cognition, language, abstract reasoning, temporal self-modeling theory of mind. Not death, not pain, just reduction. The parts of you that made you human selectively dimmed until what remained was the animal core, appetite, warmth, pattern-seeking, the present moment only. She had written a comment in the margin of the brief. She remembered this now with a strange clarity. She had written, "Surely the delivery system is the limiting factor." She looked at the city below her. The delivery system had not been the limiting factor. "How long do you think it took?" she said. Dex checked his watch, an actual watch, analog, battery-powered, the kind of affectation she had teased him for. I sent you a normal text at 7:42. You flagged Brant at 7:59. 17 minutes is when you found me. Based on what we're seeing, he scanned the streets. A police car was parked at an intersection with both doors open. Neither officer was visible. I'd say it was fast, 15 to 20 minutes citywide, probably less in denser zones. The whole planet? Unknown, but the math doesn't favor us. She looked at her hands. She was still holding her coffee cup. The coffee had gone cold. She put it down carefully on the lip of the rooftop parapet, and something about the deliberateness of that gesture, the refusal to just drop it, the small insistence on not making a mess, made her throat close briefly. "We're it," she said. Dex said, "We don't know that. We're it in this city. Maybe in this region. Maybe. How are we immune?" He didn't answer immediately, which meant he had a hypothesis he wasn't sure about. She waited. "I don't know," he said finally. "Genetic variance. Pre-existing neurological profile. Or it hasn't hit us yet, and we have a window." He paused. "Or something weirder." "Something weirder," she repeated. "I've been trying to think about what we have in common. We both drink too much coffee, and we're both bad at taking vacations. Physiologically, professionally." He turned to look at her. "We've both had extended contact with the V3 signal. Both in the transcription working group. Both full exposure for the Kovacs event, the 30-hour continuous broadcast 4 years ago." He shrugged, one shoulder. "It's possible the signal has a secondary effect, a kind of structural modification, like a vaccine you didn't know you were getting. You're saying the V3 accidentally immunized us. I'm saying that's one hypothesis among several, and right now it doesn't matter. What matters is what we do with it." She looked out over the city again. Somewhere below, a child, an actual child, maybe 5 years old, was walking down the center of the road, holding a red balloon. He looked perfectly fine. Mara watched him and thought, that child has not changed at all. He was always like this. The V3 built a weapon that turned the entire adult population of Earth into something indistinguishable from a 5-year-old with a balloon, and they couldn't even tell the difference. She found this, despite everything, faintly funny. "Okay," she said. "What do we do?" They went down at noon, when the streets were full of sunlight and the danger, such as it was easier to see. The affected, she refused to call them victims, refused to call them anything that flattened them, moved in loose, amiable clusters. They weren't violent. They weren't afraid. They seemed, in a way that was both a relief and an open wound, to be having a perfectly good time. Groups of former surgeons and engineers and school teachers were sitting on the steps of the civic library, sharing snacks from vending machines they had apparently broken open. A cluster of what looked like office workers was engaged in an elaborate game involving a shopping cart and a length of rope. Dex had said, "We need information," which meant they needed a working communication system, which meant they needed to get to the emergency coordination building's sub-basement, where the hardwired broadcast array was installed and would still be running on its own generator. To get there, they had to walk 11 blocks through the city's new citizens. "Don't look purposeful," Dex said. "I'm always purposeful. It's involuntary." "Try." She tried. She slowed her stride. She let her shoulders come down. She looked at things. A storefront, a pigeon, a fire hydrant, with the unfocused attention of someone who had nowhere specific to be. It felt profoundly wrong. It felt like lying in a language she had spoken her whole life. For the first 4 blocks, it worked. The affected barely noticed them. A few made eye contact and smiled the wide, uncomplicated smiles of people who had no reason to suspect anyone of anything. One man, heavyset, wearing what had once been a business suit, reached out and touched Mara's sleeve as she passed, then showed her a pebble he had in his other hand. She looked at the pebble. She said carefully, "Yeah, that's a good one." He beamed. On the 5th block, they hit the nest. That was what she started calling them afterward, nests. Places where the affected had gathered in larger numbers, drawn by some social residue, the ghost of old habit. The plaza outside the municipal building had always been a lunch spot. It was a lunch spot now, in a fashion. 40 or 50 people arranged on the steps and benches and the rim of the fountain, most of them eating things, some of them watching a man who had at some point found a ball and was bouncing it against a wall in steady rhythm. The sound of it, regular and hollow in the plaza, was the only organized sound in the city, Dex said under his breath. "Around. It'll add 8 minutes. Around." She had been about to argue when she noticed the woman watching them. She was standing at the edge of the plaza, near a mailbox, and she was doing what none of the others were doing. She was still. Not the engaged stillness of someone watching the ball, but the particular stillness of someone who had noticed something wrong. The woman's name tag. She was still wearing her name tag, green plastic, chipped at the corner, said Elise. She had been, before Tuesday, apparently an assistant administrator. She was looking at Mara and Dex with an expression that was hard to read from 10 feet away. Not hostile, not empty, something in between. She's tracking us, Mara said. I see it. Why is she? Elise took one step toward them, just one. Then she stopped. She tilted her head the way a dog tilts its head, processing something at the edge of its understanding. Dex, slowly, deliberately, picked up a discarded coffee cup from the ground near his feet. He examined it. He turned it over. He set it down again. Elise watched. Then she looked at the ball-bouncing man. Then back at them. Something passed across her face that Mara could not name. Something vestigial. Something that had survived the field in diminished form, like a word you half remember in a language you almost spoke. They walked around the plaza. Elise did not follow. The sub-basement was cold and smelled of old concrete and the particular institutional electricity of a room that has been running machines without human attention for too long. The broadcast array was on. The status light was green. The generator was humming, but the board was dark. Nobody had been here since before Tuesday. Mara sat down at the console. Her hands remembered the board before her brain did, which she took as a good sign. If there are other unaffected, she said, they're going to be doing the same thing we are, looking for any active signal, assuming they thought of it. People like us thought of it. People who've worked with the V3 signal, who had some exposure. We don't know that's the variable. We need a hypothesis, and we need to move on it. This is the hypothesis. She brought the array live. The static on the monitor was enormous, vast, undifferentiated electromagnetic noise across a dozen bands, more than she had ever seen. She filtered down. They're still broadcasting, she said. Look at this. Look at the power of it. The V3 signal was everywhere. It was in the municipal Wi-Fi bands, in the emergency frequencies, occupying radio spectrum that by international agreement had been reserved for human use. It was patient and huge, and it did not fluctuate. It was not a signal in the sense of a message. It was more like a condition, the way gravity was a condition, the way temperature was a condition. It had weight. They're not even watching, Dex said. What? The signal. There's no interrogative component, no monitoring pulse, no check signal. They set this up and they walked away. He pulled a chair over and sat next to her. They don't think there's anything left to watch. The implication settled between them. They think we're done, she said. They reduced humanity to a subsistence state across what I assume is most of the planet in under 20 minutes from a distance of... Where were they last cataloged? Outer Belt? They did this from the Outer Belt, and then they moved on. We're not a conquest. We're remediation. They fixed a problem and left. Mara thought about this for a moment. She thought about Brant and his paper clips. She thought about Elise at the mailbox, one step forward, tilted head. They left something behind, she said. The signal. Yes. No. I mean, the signal maintains the effect. But if the signal dropped, what happens? Do they recover? Does it reverse? Dex was quiet. If it reverses, she said, then all we need to do is knock out the signal. That's not all we need to do. That's the hardest thing that has ever been attempted by any two people in the history of, I know what it is. I'm just saying, if it reverses. She turned to look at him, because if it does, the V3 made a mistake. They left. They assumed passive maintenance would be enough. Didn't leave anyone here to watch, to adapt, to respond. They set a trap, and they walked away from the trap. She paused. That's not what you do if you think there's anything left that can fight back. Dex said slowly, they don't have a model for this. For what? For two people. He said it simply, without drama. Their model for humanity is statistical. Populations, aggregate behavior, collective response. That's why the field works. It targets the thing that makes humans a collective intelligence, the shared symbolic architecture, the interoperability of minds. Take that out. You don't get individuals. You get animals. Manageable. Predictable. He looked at the screen. But two people aren't a population. Two people aren't statistically meaningful. We're noise. We're rounding error. And rounding errors can do things populations can't. She looked at him for a moment. That's the optimistic thing you've ever said. Don't get used to it. They worked through the night. They were both tired in the way that goes past fatigue into something structural. Something that lives in the joints. They argued 3 times about approach and twice about risk tolerance. And once, briefly and with some heat, about whether it was ethical to attempt a countersignal without knowing whether restoration would be wanted by the people being restored. Dex said, "You can't consent to something you don't know you've lost." Mara said, "You also can't consent to a state of permanent reduction." They sat with the argument for a while, neither of them resolving it, and then they went back to work, because the alternative was to do nothing, and neither of them was built for nothing. The V3 signal operated at a specific resonance. They'd worked that out years ago, in the transcription group. It was why the group's members had gradually, unknowingly, developed some tolerance. Extended exposure to the signal at partial strength had done something to the relevant neural architecture, like a muscle that grows to manage a load. The counter-signal, theoretically, worked by harmonic interference, not overpowering the V3 broadcast, but disrupting its coherence, introducing a frequency that made the field unstable. The broadcast array could generate it. The question was amplitude. "We need to get it on a tower," Dex said. "Something high, wide coverage. There's a relay tower on the karst building, 14 stories. If we can access the roof, through 14 floors of affected residents, most of them are probably asleep by now. They're not strategic. They don't post guards. Most of them," she thought of Elise. Most of them. They built the modulator in 3 hours using components from the array room and 2 additional pieces of hardware that Dex sourced from the building's network closet, which she suspected he had accessed before without authorization, but chose not to ask about. When it was done, it fit in the canvas bag with room to spare and looked like nothing. A gray box with a cable coming out of it and a small antenna that folded flat. She held it for a moment before Dex took it. It weighed less than she expected. For something that was, in theory, the last argument for humanity's continued existence as a thinking species, it had the modest weight of a hardback book. The karst building lobby was dark except for the emergency lighting, which was orange-tinted and turned everything into a painting. 3 people were asleep on the lobby furniture. A security guard and 2 others she didn't recognize, curled in the unself-conscious way of children, nothing guarded about it. She watched them for a moment. She thought, "You look peaceful. I don't know if that's a mercy or an atrocity. Maybe both." They moved to the stairwell. 14 floors of stairs in the dark, with a modulator in a bag, trying to make no sound. She counted steps without meaning to. She had always counted steps. It was a thing her mind did when it had nothing else to do, and she was grateful for it now. It kept the fear organized, gave it a rhythm. On the 7th floor landing, they heard something. Not the low ambient sounds of sleeping people, the soft unconscious movements and breathing. Something alert. Footsteps, deliberate, not many. Dex stopped. She stopped. They stood in the orange dark and listened. The footsteps stopped. They waited. The fear had a texture now. Not the wild fear of danger, but the narrow fear of someone who has almost finished something important and does not want to lose it so close to the end. Then a sound she didn't expect. A voice. Not a child's babbling. Not the meaningless vocalizations she had heard all day from the affected. A voice saying in a rasp that was clearly a whisper trying not to be heard through a door. "I know you're in there. I know there's 2 of you. I was watching from the 4th floor. I'm still." A pause. She could hear in that pause how much it cost. "I'm still me, I think. It hasn't taken me. I don't know why. Please. Please don't go." She and Dex looked at each other in the orange dark. She opened the stairwell door. His name was Torres. He had been an electrician for the building, which meant he knew every access panel, every utility corridor, every shortcut through the walls of the karst building that the blueprints didn't show. He had been hiding in a utility closet since Tuesday morning, eating granola bars from a vending machine he had maintained the sense to pay for, holding very still whenever the sounds on the floor got loud. He was shaking when she first saw him. He stopped shaking after about 10 minutes, but she noticed that he kept touching things. The wall, the handrail, his own face, with a deliberateness that was not habit. He was checking, making sure the world was still solid. She understood this completely. "Why didn't you go outside?" she said. "I tried." He looked at his hands. "There's a group on 3 that's different. Not like the others. They're organized, not talking, but they move together, like they're coordinating. I don't know how. And they noticed me in a way the others didn't. I came back in." She and Dex exchanged a glance. "How long has that group been there?" Dex asked. "Since last night. I think they were drawn to the building. The signal from your array might have, I don't know, agitated something. Some residual. A residual pattern recognition response," Mara said. "Even at reduced capacity, they can detect anomalous signals. It's not cognition, it's deeper than that. Older. So they know something's different, Dex said. They don't know what, but they know. Torres said, "What are you going to do?" She told him. She told him the whole thing, the counter signal, the modulator, the relay tower on the roof, the theory about reversal. She told him about the harmonic interference and the exposed architecture and the rounding error logic. She told him about Elise at the mailbox, tilted head, something surviving in the wreckage. Torres listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Is this going to work? I don't know. What happens if it doesn't?" Then we've spent everything we have, and the answer is still no. And we'll have spent it anyway because there's nothing else worth spending it on. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know a way to the roof that doesn't go through 3. They went up through the walls. Torres moved through the access corridors with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years in spaces not designed to be seen, and Mara followed with her hand on the rough plywood sheathing and thought about the ship. The Vathri ship, wherever it was now, moving through the outer dark, its crew, or operators, or whatever. They were probably not thinking about Earth at all anymore. Thinking about whatever came next, the next remediation, the next problem to be solved. She thought, "You made a mistake so small you couldn't even see it. You built a perfect solution, and you forgot to account for the part where 3 people who shouldn't exist find each other in a stairwell." The roof was cold and very clear. The city below was mostly dark. A few battery lights visible in windows, the orange wash of emergency lighting here and there, a handful of fires that looked deliberately set for warmth rather than damage. The stars were extraordinary. Without the light pollution, they were back. All of them. The whole overcrowded sky. And she stood on the roof of the Karst building with a modulator in her hand and looked up at them and felt something that was not quite hope and not quite anger, but was made of both. Dex found the relay connection point. Torres helped him splice in the modulator. It took 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, she heard movement on the floor below, not close, not organized, but present, aware. "How long does it need to run?" Torres asked. "We don't know," Dex said. "The theoretical models say continuous exposure to the counter signal for between 20 minutes and 2 hours to achieve measurable effect. The variance is, we stand here for 2 hours. Potentially, yes." Torres looked at her. She looked at Dex. Dex finished the splice and stood up and said, "Activating." The modulator's light came on. Green. She could not hear anything. No sound. No vibration. But she knew it was running because the signal monitor on Dex's phone, which he had configured to track the Vathri frequency, showed the first tremor of interference. A hairline crack in the signal's coherence. Barely visible, it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in days. 22 minutes in, she heard the first sound from below. That was not what the affected sounded like. It was crying. Not a child's crying. Not the immediate, unfiltered distress of someone who does not know what crying is for. This was adult crying. The kind that knows it is crying, that has a reason, that is working through something. 40 minutes in, there was a voice. Indistinct through the rooftop access door, several floors below, but a voice with grammar. A voice asking a question. She and Dex did not speak to each other for a long time. They stood at the edge of the roof in the cold and watched the city, and gradually, not all at once, not cleanly, in the stuttering, uneven way that real things change, they began to see lights come on. Not emergency orange, the warm white of someone who had found a lamp and wanted to see something. Torres sat against the relay housing with his arms around his knees. At some point, he started humming. She recognized it after a moment, an old song, something from childhood, generic enough that she couldn't place it exactly. He wasn't doing it for her. He was doing it for himself, the way you do something physical to confirm you still can. She thought of Brandt and his paper clips. She thought of him coming back to himself in the dark of the office, alone, the tower of paper clips on the floor in front of him. She hoped someone was with him when it happened. She hoped he wasn't afraid. She thought about what Dex had said. They don't have a model for this. For 2 people and now 3. 3 rounding errors in the vast statistical certainty of a solved problem. On the street below, 7 stories down, she saw a woman stand up from where she had been sitting and look around her with the specific bewilderment of someone who has woken up in the wrong place. She saw the woman turn in a slow circle, not the empty turning of the affected, but the searching turn of someone trying to orient. The woman put her hands to her face. Her shoulders moved. Mara looked away. Some things were not meant to be watched. The signal counter on Dex's phone showed the Vathri broadcast degrading. Not dying, not yet, but losing coherence, losing reach. In a city of millions, degradation was not victory. But it was a direction. It was a thing that was happening because 3 people had chosen to make it happen. She remembered something from the V3 linguistic analysis. One of the structures the team had identified in the broadcast signal, before any of them had understood what the signal was actually for, was a repeated phrase. The linguists had argued about it for months. The most common translation was something like, "The matter is settled," or "The work is complete," or in one dissenting interpretation that had always sat uneasily with her. "Nothing here can answer us." She put her hand on the relay housing. She felt the vibration of the modulator running, that small, stubborn frequency, less powerful than a radio transmitter, doing the only thing it needed to do. "Hey," she said. To the signal, to the empty sky, to whatever was out there in the outer dark that had decided this was a solved problem, she said it quietly, not loud, not angry, with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact. "You're wrong about that." The signal broke at hour 3. Not fully. The V3 broadcast was still present, still broadcasting from whatever platform they had positioned in the outer belt, but its coherence was gone. It fractured into noise. The harmonic interference pattern, running for 3 continuous hours from one relay tower on the roof of one building in one city, had introduced a cascade instability that the broadcast could not self-correct for. The technical explanation, which Dex would write up over the following weeks, ran to 60 pages, and he said it still felt incomplete. What had happened was not cleanly describable in terms of human signal engineering. It was something about the specific resonance structure of human cortical architecture and the way the countersignal exploited the same vulnerability the V3 had targeted, but in reverse, using the brain's own elasticity to push back against the suppression. What Mara remembered was simpler, the sound the city made when it started waking up. It was not a good sound, not at first. Pain and confusion and grief are loud, and they were very loud that morning. But underneath them, woven through them, was the unmistakable sound of people asking questions, asking them of each other, asking them into empty rooms, asking them in all the ways that only beings with the capacity for abstract thought ask questions. Not just what happened, but why, not just where am I, but what does this mean? Not just are you there, but are you okay? That was the sound. She stood on the roof with Torres and Dex in the early gray light, and she listened to it rise from the city like smoke. The V3 had looked at humanity and seen a problem. They had identified the mechanism by which the problem operated, that strange, overcrowded human quality of building inner worlds, shared symbols, the ability to be in 2 places at once, the past and the present, the real and the imagined. And they had switched it off. Clean, efficient, the work was complete. They had not understood what they were switching off. They had not modeled it. You could not model it, because the thing that made humans human was precisely the thing that refused to be modeled, the part that turned rounding, errors, and resistance, that found each other in stairwells, that built transmitters out of network hardware and stayed on rooftops in the cold for 3 hours because it could imagine what 3 hours from now might look like, and decided that mattered. The V3 were very old and very capable, and they had made one mistake. They had assumed that a species which could be reduced would choose, given the chance, to stay reduced. There were 11 others in the building when they finally came back down. People who had stayed themselves through the night, held on by whatever combination of luck and neurology and sheer bloody-minded refusal, and had found each other floor by floor as the counter-signal reached them. An ER nurse named Paloma, who had barricaded herself in the 7th floor break room and spent 14 hours doing Sudoku puzzles on paper because she had read something once about cognitive maintenance under stress and had decided it was worth trying. A retired engineer named Vasquez, who was 81 years old, and had told Torres when they met in the lobby that he suspected his hearing aids had acted as partial shielding. A teenager, 16, who had been in the middle of a standardized exam when the field hit and had sat at her desk in the empty classroom for 11 hours finishing it because she had decided that abandoning the exam would be giving in to something, though she couldn't have said what. Mara looked at all of them. She looked at their faces, the particular faces of people who had held on to something difficult in the dark and were still holding it. She thought, the V3 solved the wrong problem. They looked at humanity and they saw the collective, the network, the interoperability, the aggregate power of 7 billion minds in continuous symbolic contact. And the collective was frightening. She understood that. The collective was large and loud, and it built things, and it spread, and it was, in the most neutral assessment, a dominant organism with expansionist properties. She could see why you would want to solve it. But you couldn't solve it by targeting the collective. Because the collective was not the thing. The collective was just what happened when the thing got together in large enough numbers. The thing was this: one person in an empty classroom finishing an exam for no audience. One electrician paying for his granola bars. One woman who couldn't stop counting steps. You couldn't field suppress that. You could suppress the mechanism temporarily. And when the mechanism came back, the thing would still be there, intact. Because the thing was not the mechanism. The thing was older. The thing was the part of a human being that decided, in the absence of any reasonable expectation of success, that some things were worth doing anyway. She didn't know how to explain this to the Vathri. She suspected that was precisely the problem. The work that came after was long and unglamorous and often painful, and she wouldn't choose to spare any of it. The world came back to itself the way any large thing does, unevenly, incompletely, with enormous amounts of grief about what had happened in the gaps. There were people who didn't recover fully. There were people who recovered but were changed. There were children who had been affected who came back to themselves and had to be told, carefully, by people who were still holding themselves together, what had happened and what it meant. The Vathri signal continued to broadcast from the outer belt. Whether the platform was automated or attended, whether any Vathri were aware of the counter-signal or the recovery, was unknown. The Cosmic Signal Analysis team rebuilt itself from whoever was left and went back to work on decoding the broadcast, this time with the specific goal of finding something transmissible, something that could be sent back. Dex wrote 60 pages on the counter-signal mechanics and then was asked to write 60 more, and he did. Torres became the primary technical advisor for the relay network expansion. He put in very long hours. He paid for all his own snacks. Paloma, the ER nurse, submitted a paper to an academic journal about cognitive maintenance techniques under extreme stress. The reviewers asked for revisions, and she sent them back with a note that said, "I have suggestions regarding your timeline expectations." The paper was eventually published. The teenager finished her standardized exam. She got a B-, which she considered respectable given the circumstances. Mara went back to the coordination office. Brant was there on the first day back, slightly thinner, slightly quieter, with a way of pausing before he spoke that was new. He sat at his desk. He wrote a memo. It was 30 pages long, and nobody had asked for it. But she read the whole thing, and it was good. She brought him coffee, unasked. He looked up. "You seem..." He started. "I'm fine," she said. "You?" He thought about it. The real thought, the kind that takes a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I will be." She nodded. She went back to her desk. Outside the window, the city was loud, imperfect, grieving, resilient, in the process of deciding what it was going to be, which was the only process it had ever known. She opened her laptop. She started to work. The stars were still out there. The Vathri signal was still broadcasting. Somewhere in the outer belt, something very old had made a decision about humanity and moved on. It had been wrong. It would find out, not today, maybe not for a generation, but in the particular way of things that refused to stay solved. In the way of a species that finishes exams in empty rooms and hums songs in the dark, and pays for granola bars on the honor system when the world has ended, and builds transmitters to fight back with, because it can imagine a morning where the transmitter worked. Humanity was already composing its response. It was going to take a while to get the translation right. They had time.